Hey everybody, hope this finds you doing well. This is Danelle here at Networkchain. Today we're going to talk about some of the major news stories over this past week, as well as talk a little bit more about the fundamentals of Bitcoin and why it could be one of the better performing assets, not only now, but also in the next 5, 10, 20, 50 years from now. So let's go ahead and start with the cryptocurrency market update. As usual, you can see Bitcoin has made a nice leap up over the last week, up 7.31% at $64,000. Ethereum seeing a nice bump up as well, up 4% at $2,768. BNB up 7%, Solana up nearly 10%, right at around that 160 range. XRP up 5%, trading at 60 cents. Dogecoin still kind of in that 10-cent range. It's currently trading at 11 cents, up nearly 7% over the past 7 days. Toncoin, on the news that its founder has been arrested in France, has been down over the past day or so, and it's now down over 12% over the last 7 days, now trading under $6. And you have Tron, which has replaced Cardano in the top 10, currently up 22% over the last week, trading at 16 cents. And so you see Cardano now holding at the number 11 spot, up 14% over the last 7 days, trading at 38 cents. So if we take a closer look at Bitcoin, you can see that we're still trading in that range, basically between that $55,000 to $70,000 range. We've pretty much been ranging for the past 5 months. So we'll see if we're going to make any leaps forward, but we have to basically get back to that all-time high, which is around $73,000, and see if we can get above that and close the weekly candle above that range. But we haven't seen that. It hasn't happened since we saw that all-time high, so it still remains to be seen if we're going to change the trend. Right now we're actually still in a bit of a down trend. If you see that we have lower highs every time we popped back up, we couldn't get quite past above that 70,000 range. So we did break 50 a couple of weeks ago when we had that Monday crash on August 5th, but we have recovered quite nicely, and Bitcoin is now at $64,000. So really it's just a matter of time, especially considering a lot of people who study Bitcoin day in and day out. They believe at some point in time, given the inflows that we continue to see going into those Bitcoin ETFs, that at some point we will break out from this range, whether it be later on this year or sometime in 2025. So one thing that we need to consider, and always consider when we're doing investing, is that you need to make sure that you check into the macroeconomic environment, particularly here in the United States. One of the major factors that is involved in investing, particularly in the range that a lot of assets can go into, really relies on the data coming from the Federal Reserve, particularly when it comes to inflation as well as interest rates. So a lot of companies rely on borrowing money and using money to be able to build their businesses and be able to provide jobs, and it also depends on what they're going to price their products at, depending on the money supply as well as inflation. So when we look here, and this is one of the major factors that the Federal Reserve looks into when they are determining their monetary policy. And if you can look here, we're looking at the 12-month percentage change for the CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, and you can see all the different categories that it considers when it comes up with the percentage that inflation is compared to the year prior. So as you can see, we finally got the interest rate to get down below 3%. Now, the Federal Reserve said they wanted to get it down to 2% before they started to cut rates, but Jerome Powell just spoke this past week, and he intimated that they will be shifting their policy, and instead of staying at that Fed fund rate, which is between 5.25 and 5.5%, which is the interest rate, they will probably be looking to cut interest rate at least a few basis points. So we could go down 25 basis points to 50 basis points. So we may go from that 5.25% or 5.5% down to maybe 5% interest rate before the end of the year. It could potentially be even lower than that. But you can see that over the last 2 years, the Federal Reserve was aggressively raising interest rates to cut down on this high inflation rate of over 9% 2 years ago in June of 2022. So now that they've gotten it down, the market responded from Jerome Powell's comments, and a lot of the major assets in the S&P 500 started to see a run-up after those comments. So another thing that you have to look at is the US M2 supply. So another reason why people find Bitcoin so attractive is because of the fact that it's a deflationary asset. There will only be 21 million Bitcoin, and with fiat currencies, which are run by central banks of various countries around the world, they can print as much money as they need depending on their particular monetary policy for that jurisdiction. So if you see here in the United States, the M2 supply, which is the supply that refers to the measure of money supply that includes financial assets held mainly by households such as savings deposits, time deposits and balances, and retail money market mutual funds, in addition to more readily available liquid financial assets as defined by the M1 measure of money, such as currency, traveler's checks, demand deposits, and other checkable deposits. So the M2 supply basically considers all of the financial assets that are being held in the and circulated within the United States, or really outside of the United States as well, but is currently being circulated out in the market. And so you can see here, since 2020, when the pandemic occurred, you can see that the Federal Reserve gave the green light to print a lot of money. So nearly 40%, actually over 40% of all of the money supply, which was around 15 trillion at the end of 2019, and in February of 2020, before the pandemic was considered a pandemic in March of 2020, you can see that the M2 supply was around 15 trillion, and now we're upwards just above 21 trillion. So there was a lot. So nearly half of the entire money supply was printed in the last 4 years. So what happens when you see more money supply, you're going to have inflation. As you can see here, the US M2 money stock is critical in understanding and forecasting money supply, inflation, and inflation rates and interest rates in the United States. Historically, when the money supply dramatically increased in global economies, there would be a following dramatic increase in prices, thus basically inflation, of goods and services, which would then follow monetary policy with the aim to maintain inflation levels low. So that's when the Federal Reserve has to step in and try to figure out what the interest rates would work to try to get inflation rates down, because they still want to keep inflation at a range that isn't too high. No matter what, you're going to have inflation year after year. Prices continue to go up, but the interest rates could also affect, obviously, the inflation rates. And so since we went from 9% in 2022 now to under 3% here in 2024, the Federal Reserve is now going to cut from those aggressive interest rate hikes, and now we're starting to see that it's looking like they're going to start to cut and have interest rate cuts, and hopefully we can see some of these prices continue to go down, but that remains to be seen. But in the meantime, the reason why people look to put their money into other assets like gold, which people consider as an inflation hedge, as a store of value. Many, as we've talked about here before in the past, Bitcoin is considered digital gold, and that with its finite supply, it too at some point will be an inflation hedge. It hasn't really shown that just yet, but as we see over time, you can look at from 2010 now into 2024, you can see that the inflation rate has dramatically decreased, because as we know, Bitcoin miners produce Bitcoin, and every 4 years, or approximately every 4 years, those mining rewards and the Bitcoin that comes into circulation is cut in half. So it gets cut in half approximately every 4 years. So all of the 21 million supply is likely to be out at around 2140. The year 2140 is when all of the Bitcoin should be mined, but right now the mining reward is at 6.25, and soon it will be 3.125 in 2028 or so on downward. So it'll continue to decrease. As you can see, it's been decreasing ever since 2010, and so that is a stark contrast to what we're seeing in the M2 supply, where it's going up exponentially. You're seeing the Bitcoin supply is going down exponentially as it's going into circulation. So places like El Salvador, which is a country that made Bitcoin legal tender, so you can transact with governmental entities in El Salvador with Bitcoin. They will accept Bitcoin as legal tender. They continue to not only transact in Bitcoin, but they're also investing in Bitcoin and buying more every day. They're actually, since March, have started buying 1 Bitcoin per day. They also mine Bitcoin, and they made a large investment a few years ago. And you can see here, with each new Bitcoin purchase, the country's financial future becomes increasingly tied to the fortunes of this unpredictable crypto market. So obviously it's a huge so-called gamble, but because El Salvador, as well as many other countries, have dealt with major inflation. In the United States, we've had inflation, as you can see, up to 9% 2 years ago, but there's some countries that have had double-digit inflation rates from 10 to 15 to 20, even higher in some countries where that inflation rate has been over 50%. So they're looking for other ways to find value because of the fact that their fiat dollars are becoming basically worthless. So you can see here and read this article here on Cointelegraph, which goes over Bukele, who is the president an architect of El Salvador's Bitcoin adoption, and how he plans to continue to invest into Bitcoin. And so far they have nearly 6,000 Bitcoin on their balance sheet, and they have transferred over 5,689 Bitcoin into cold storage in March of 2024. And since then they have continued to buy 1 Bitcoin per day, as well as their mining when they're using volcanic geothermal energy. Of course, the other big player in Bitcoin accumulation is MicroStrategy. They started their Bitcoin standard strategy on August 10th of 2020, so just over 4 years ago. And you can see it has outperformed every single stock in the S&P 500 over the last 4 years. So it just goes to show that if you buy Bitcoin, continue to buy Bitcoin, and MicroStrategy has continued to dollar cost average into Bitcoin. Michael Saylor has said in the past he will continue to buy Bitcoin forever. So they plan on holding Bitcoin forever. And you can see those who have invested in MicroStrategy since they have started this strategy of buying into the Bitcoin standard, they have outperformed the S&P 500 as well as individual stocks in the S&P 500. So just a breakdown of getting a general idea and understanding of Bitcoin versus fiat currencies. Please make sure to check us out here on X. We post here nearly every day, as well as on Instagram, basically almost every day. And you can see here we talk about not only what's happening with Bitcoin, but also other major news stories in the cryptocurrency market. So please make sure to check us out there. Thank you so much for watching us here on YouTube. We really appreciate you. Please feel free to comment if you have anything that you would like us to cover moving forward in the future. We look forward to linking up with you on the network chain. In the meantime, take care. Bye-bye.